Yo, what's good people, it's JayCactus, and in today's video I'm going to be going over sound selection. So I'm going to be talking about how to pick your drums, how to pick your instruments, how to layer your instruments and give everything its own space in the mix. So let's get into it. Alright, so the first thing that I want to go through is instruments and how to layer your instruments properly and avoid anything clashing. And honestly, sound selection is just something that you develop over time. Like when you make a lot of beats, you start to develop an ear for it and you kind of know what instruments complement each other. But if you're a beginner, there are some go-to techniques that you can use and some visual techniques that you can use as well, which I'm going to show you now. So the easiest way to show you is on an EQ. So every sound has a frequency or a frequency range in an EQ. So if I use this piano here, this C is hitting around the low mids, and then each of these lines are harmonics, which I'm not going to go into right now. But you can see where I press the note on the keys, like if I press it lower down, the frequencies are going to be lower, higher up, the frequencies are higher. So when you're layering sounds, the main goal is to avoid frequencies clashing in the mix. So when you've got too many instruments that share the same frequency range, they start to cancel each other out, and I'll go through that further in a bit. But just for this demo, I've come up with a simple melody, so I'm just going to show you where the keys are hitting in the EQ. So you can see that this piano is hitting around the low mids and the mids, which is fine because I know that my 808s and my bass is going to take up this kind of range here, like the sub and the bass. That's where the 808 and the kick is going to be. So again, you want each instrument to kind of cover its own range. So if I play you the bass by itself, you're going to see it's taking up the low end. You will get some that are overlapping, which is fine, but you're just looking at the main frequencies, these bright parts here. And if I play the bass with the keys, so let's say you have some keys and now you're thinking about what sound you want to layer it with. Well, the easiest thing to do is think of instruments that are bright. So after keys, if I know the keys are hitting around the low mids and mids, I want to think of some bright instruments. So I'm thinking strings, maybe arps or like flutes, just something that has like bright sounds to it. So for this one, I'm layering it with some strings. Now let me play the strings by itself and you'll see where the strings are hitting. So you can see that these strings are hitting around the mids, definitely got some high mids as well. And when I layer them with the keys, you can hear that nothing's getting lost, so you can easily hear the keys and you can easily hear the strings, and that's because they're not clashing in the same frequency range. Like the strings are taking up the higher area and then the keys are taking up the low mids and the mids. So let me just show you another example. If I was going to layer this piano with another piano, let's just choose any random one, chances are it's going to get lost. So let me play these two together. So the other one by itself, and then layered. You can't really hear the second piano, and that's because they're fighting for the same frequency range. So try to avoid using the same kind of instruments, but if you do really want to do that, then an easy trick is to just bring the other one up an octave. So like I was showing you before, if I press a key and then press it further up, you can see it's going to hit in a different frequency range. So right now I've brought these keys up. I could bring them up again. You can start to hear them a bit more clearly, but it just sounds a bit muddy, so that's why I tend to use brighter instruments if I'm layering it. Another thing to bear in mind is the way that you process sounds will also affect the frequency range it's hitting in as well. So for example, these keys that I'm using, I've applied halftime to them. So before the keys were hitting a bit further up, but halftime actually brought the frequency range a bit down. So without really explaining like why time affects pitch, I'm just going to show you what it sounds like here. So I've taken halftime off. It might sound a bit weird because I obviously adjusted the melody to work with halftime. You can see that it's hitting a few higher mids which we didn't have before. So if I put halftime back on, it brings it just a bit lower. So that's one thing to bear in mind. And just remember that different instruments have different characteristics. So if I was layering strings with keys and they were playing in the same octave, then the strings still might stand out just because they tend to sound brighter. So they're gonna hit different frequencies. But if you didn't wanna layer your keys with strings, you could try something like pads or arps because they can be quite bright too. And then from there, you could add another layer of like brass instruments, flutes, woodwinds, or even bells. The next thing that I'm gonna layer on this is an arp. So I'm gonna play the arp by itself. So it's covering a wide range, but I think if I bring this up an octave, now I'm getting more high energy because I've already used a lot of low mids and mids. And let's just see how these work together. So they work quite well together because you can still hear each instrument by itself, like nothing's really getting lost in the mix. So that's a trick that you can use again. Just if something sounds like it's being lost in the mix, try and bring it up an octave and then see how it compares then. All right, so for instruments, you're starting with the bass, then you're moving up to keys, then you're moving up to strings, pads, or arps. Then you can move up to bells, woodwinds, and horns. And then finally, you could go with something like a lead. But with the top ones, try to bring them up an octave so they're taking up the higher frequencies. So moving on to the drums, I'm gonna start with the kick and the 808. Choosing an 808, it just depends on what genre you're making. So in this one, it's gonna be a drill track. So usually drill tracks are using long 808s. But if you were making like a melodic trap beat, you might want something bouncy. And then in that case, you pick a short 808. And honestly, the most important part is just choosing high quality sounds from the start. I know a lot of people say that, but it's true. Because when people have made these high quality sounds, they've already used compressors, they've already used equalizers, saturation, distortion, whatever they needed to make the sound good in the first place, so you don't have to do that. So for the 808, I'm using one in my new drum kit, which I'm working on. So you can already hear that it's got some distortion. So it's got some nice low end, but then you can see that there's some energy in the mids as well, leading up to the high mids. So that distortion in there is going to help it cut through phones, and it's just going to sound better for drill beats. All right, so now for the kicks, there's a few different things that I'm going to show you here. So the first thing is selecting the right kick. Now, again, this is just depending on what genre you're making. So if you're making boom bap beats, then go for a live kick. If you're making drill or trap beats, then go for a process kick. And what I look for when I'm selecting my kick is I just want to make sure that it's working well with the 808. So this is just personal preference, but for me, I like the 808 to take up all of the low end, and then I like to get that punch from the kick. So let me just show you here. So you can hear that the 808 is covering the low end, and I'm getting a nice punch from the kick. But if I picked a live kick, then it would sound like this. It just doesn't sound right at all. And then with this kick, make sure you're listening in headphones because this kick's got a lot of sub frequencies. So you'll be able to see it on the EQ. All this energy down here. And it's kind of long as well. It's just going to muddy up the 808. So if I play this, you can hear it if you listen closely. It just makes it a bit muddy when them kicks have got too many sub frequencies as well. And then another kick that I'm going to show you is a highly processed kick. So this is a kick that I included in my drum kit. So you can see just by looking at the waveform that this kick is being like pushed to the max. So I made this kick just for people that don't want to do any processing to the drums at all. So they just want to put it in there, put a soft clipper on the master, and then that's it. Because I've already pushed this kick kind of hard. So the way that people get the distortion on the kicks is by purposely clipping them. So don't listen to your college teacher who tells you that clipping is bad, because shit's changed from back then. And right now people like that distortion that they get from clipping. I like it in my drums anyway. So you can hear that it's got some distortion, which is creating some high end there. And there's not much that I need to do to this kick. I don't need to turn it up or anything. So if I play it with the 808, like it just sounds good together already. This kick is a little bit lighter, but it's got more punch. And I've brought the volume up a bit, which I didn't need to do on the other one. You also need to make sure that your kick and your 808 are in phase. And what I mean by that is, I did kind of go through it in my kick and 808 mixing video. So if you haven't seen that, then definitely check that out. But I'll show you again here. So when you hear people talking about the phase of a sound, it's basically the shape of this waveform here. So you can see that it's kind of going up and down and up and down. And then 808, if you zoomed in, it would have kind of a similar look. And let me show you what happens when things are out of phase. I'm just going to bring this into the playlist. So out of phase basically means Let me just duplicate this, make this one unique, and then I'm gonna reverse the phase. Reverse polarity is just reversing the phase. So now you can see, I can't zoom in any further, but every time a waveform's going up, the opposite one is going down. So you can see here there's a dip, but up here it's rising. If that's happening, that means that the sounds are out of phase and they're gonna cancel each other out. So if I play this, you can't hear anything. That's the sound by itself. That's the sound cancelled out because of the phase. That's a phase issue. So what you find is when you're picking a kick and an 808, the 808s look kind of similar to the kicks when they're zoomed in. So when you're layering them, sometimes you'll get phase cancellation. It might not be like the full sound, but there might be some parts of the kick or some parts of the 808. So you might basically hear some low end disappear. So I've just pulled in another kick just to give you an example. So if I reverse this, let's say the sample was already like this, and then you clicked it again. And now you can hear all of that low energy coming back. So that's what you're looking for in phase. So when you're picking a kick in an 808, just make sure that they're in phase. Just always try reverse the polarity in the kick. And if it sounds better when it's reversed, then go with that. So when it comes to the snare, again, it depends on the genre of the track and the vibe you're going for. So for this beat, it's kind of a dark drill beat. And I know that chop snares are used quite commonly in drill beats. So I'll use the chop snare as an example. And you can hear that it's got some punch. Like it's standing out in the mix, it's crisp, so that's the kind of sound that I like. I want something with a bit of crisp when I'm choosing a snare. Obviously you could pick a clap or a rim shot as well, so just play around, see what sounds better to you. Just as another example, I'll use a snare. See, this just isn't standing out as much to me. And then if I used a clap, like it's standing out, but again, to me, it just doesn't fit the vibe of the track. So I think the chop snare works well in here. And you can see when I click the snare, there's a lot of energy in it. It's got that high energy, but then there's also some low mids as well. So you kind of get the meat from the low mids when you're choosing a snare. So look for that in a sample, like pull up an EQ and then play around with some samples, see which ones have some high presence and then a few low mids as well, because that's where you're going to get the meat. But you can also look at the sample itself. So if you open it up, you can see like Cymatics usually have good samples. Like their clap here, it's not been processed like too much, so you'll still have headroom in your track. So if I boosted this, like if you found a sample like this, I'd probably stay away from it because it's just been pushed too hard. Apart from kicks, like sometimes kicks will sound good. Or for any instrument, like sometimes that distortion might sound good, but generally if you want like a good clean sample, then find something that hasn't been push too much. So just by looking at the waveform and seeing if things are squashed, like if it was clipped too much, it would look something like that. But if I bring it back down, you can see that it's just a clean sample. You've got some headroom to play with. It hasn't been driven too hard, so you should be good with something like that. Now I'm just going to show you what the EQ is looking like now with all of the instruments except the hi-hat. So you can see that covering most of the energy. There's just some treble which is missing, but that's where the hi-hat comes in. So again, for hi-hats, I like to find a nice crisp sample. So for this one, this is another one from my kit. You can see that I haven't pushed it too hard, but it is taking up that high energy, which I want right now. It's a nice clean sample, so if I put this in, now we're covering everything. And then for perks, I'm not really going to go into perks, but again, just look for a nice clean sample that hasn't been pushed too hard, so you've got some headroom, and then just see what works well in the track. And if things aren't sounding too right, then just try and pitch them up a little bit. Odd. So I won't go too much into perks just because you're following the same kind of principle. So just find a nice clean sample from the start, something that hasn't been pushed too hard and hasn't been like overly compressed or limited, something that isn't squashed. And don't be afraid to pitch things up and down as well. So for example, if you had a perk or let's just say a hi-hat, and let's say the sample that you found was like this. That was the sample that you put in. But to you it didn't sound right and you wanted something a bit brighter, then instead of going through your library trying to find another sample, just pitch it up. And now it's fitting well in the mix. So I hope you liked the video and I hope you took some gems from it. These are some tips that I wanted to know when I first started producing, because a lot of people were telling me to focus on sound selection, but I didn't really know what they meant. So hopefully this has made it a bit more clear. And if you use techniques like this, then your mixes will come out 10 times cleaner. So if you did take something from it, then please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.